seem very reliant on accepting Putin's worldview rather than perhaps the stark reality of the barbarism with which he's executed this war.
Yeah, maybe because I know too much about the United States, because the first war in Europe after World War II was the U.S. bombing of Belgrade for 78 days to change borders of a European state. The idea was to break Serbia, to create Kosovo as an enclave, and then to install Bondesteel, which is the largest NATO base in the Balkans, in the Southwest Balkans. So the U.S. started this under Clinton, that we will break the borders, we will illegally bomb another country. We didn't have any UN authority. This was a, quote, NATO mission to do that. Then I know the United States went to war repeatedly, illegally, in what it did in Afghanistan, and then what it did in Iraq, and then what it did in Syria, which was the Obama administration, especially Obama and Hillary Clinton, tasking the CIA to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, and then what it did with NATO illegally bombing Libya to topple Muammar Gaddafi, and then what it did in Kiev in February 2014. I happened to see some of that with my own eyes. The U.S. overthrew Yanukovych together with right-wing Ukrainian military forces. We overthrew a president. And what's interesting, by the way, is we overthrew Yanukovych the day after the European Union representatives had reached an agreement with Yanukovych to have early elections, a government of national unity, and a stand down of both sides. That was agreed. The next thing that happens is the opposition, quote unquote, says we don't agree. They stormed the government buildings and they deposed Yanukovych. And within hours, the United States says, yes, we support the new government. It didn't say, oh, we had an agreement. That's unconstitutional what you did. So we overthrew a government, contrary to a promise that the European Union had made. And by the way, Russia, the United States, and the EU were parties to that agreement. And the United States, an hour afterwards, backed the coup. Okay, so everyone's got a little bit to answer for. In 2015, the Russians did not say, we want the Donbass back. They said peace should come through negotiations, and negotiations between the ethnic Russians in the east of Ukraine and this new regime in Kiev led to the Minsk II agreement. The Minsk II agreement was voted by the UN Security Council unanimously. It was signed by the government of Ukraine. It was guaranteed explicitly by Germany and France. And you know what? And it's been explained to me in person. It was laughed at inside the US government. This is after the UN Security Council unanimously accepted it. The Ukrainians said, we don't want to give autonomy to the region. Oh, but that's part of the treaty. The US told them, don't worry about it. Angela Merkel explained in Die Zeit, in a notorious interview after the 2022 escalation, she said, oh, you know, we knew that Minsk II was just a holding pattern to give Ukraine time to build its strength. No. Minsk II was a UN Security Council unanimously adopted treaty that was supposed to end the war. So when it comes to who's trustworthy, who to believe, and so forth, I guess my problem, Piers, is I know the United States government. I know it very well. I don't trust them for a moment. I want these two sides actually to sit down in front of the whole world and say, these are the terms. Then the world can judge. Because we could get on paper clearly for both sides of the world, we're not going to overthrow governments anymore, the United States needs to say. We accept this agreement, the United States needs to say. Russia needs to say we're not stepping 1 foot farther than whatever the boundary is actually reached. And NATO's not going to enlarge. And let's put it for the whole world to see. You know, once in a while, treaties actually hold.
Baltic.
Well, I think that's exactly what happened here. I think you have to go back to the 1990s to understand what's going on in Ukraine. There was a big debate in the Clinton administration about whether to move NATO eastward, whether there would be NATO expansion or not.
Yes.
And inside the Clinton administration, there were a good number of people who were adamantly opposed to expanding NATO because they thought in realist terms. They believed that the Russians would see this as a threat. And as NATO got closer and closer to Russia's borders, it would all blow up in our face. And they fought tooth and nail to prevent it. This included people like George Kennan. It included Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, who has said he thought about resigning from the Clinton administration over this very issue. But these realists were opposed by a good number of liberals, and this included the president himself, Tony Lake, who was his national security advisor, Richard Holbrooke, and a number of others who believed that NATO expansion was a good thing. They had a more liberal mindset and thought that this would help promote democracy and economic prosperity in Eastern Europe. It would not be threatening to the Russians because they would see us as a benign hegemon, and we would live happily ever after. But what happened is the realists lost, the liberals won, and we started to expand NATO. We got away with a big tranche of expansion first in 1999. That's when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic came in. Then we got away with another big tranche of expansion in 2004. This is when the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, Slovakia all came in. But then in 2008, the trouble started, because in April 2008, we thought in terms of a third big tranche. And this time we said explicitly that NATO was going to bring Georgia and Ukraine into the alliance. The Russians made it unequivocally clear that this was not going to happen. And Putin made it unequivocally clear at the time that it was a move that would lead to the destruction of Ukraine. Now, very importantly, John, at the NATO summit in Bucharest in April 2008, where this policy decision was made, Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, the leaders respectively of Germany and France, were unequivocally opposed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. And Angela Merkel has said that the reason that she was opposed was because she thought that Putin would view it as a declaration of war. So if you think about it here, you have all these policymakers and prominent individuals like Kennan in the 90s, and then you have Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy who are saying this is not a smart thing to do. And Bill Burns, who's now the head of the CIA, and in April 2008 was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, wrote a memo to Condoleezza Rice, then the Secretary of State, basically telling her that this is the brightest of red lines and it's going to lead to unending trouble if we continue to pursue bringing Ukraine into NATO. So there were a lot of people who were opposed. And I joined that bandwagon in effect, right? Because I wrote this famous article in 2014 after the crisis in Ukraine broke out, saying that it was the West's fault, in effect, for expanding NATO eastward. But what happened here is that we doubled down at every turn. It's really quite remarkable. After the crisis broke out in February of 2014, instead of backing off, reevaluating the situation, we doubled down. And we have done that at every turn since then. And the end result is that we're now in this horrendous war that turns one's stomach when you think of what is happening to Ukraine. And my bottom line here is that this decision to expand NATO into Ukraine was irresponsible in the extreme because of the consequences for the Ukrainian people, for the consequences that flowed from this decision for Ukraine as a functioning society. I mean, it's being destroyed. I believe this could have been avoided had we not expanded NATO or tried to expand NATO into Ukraine. Had we backed off, but we didn't do that, and now we're paying the price. Actually, to be clear, it's the Ukrainians who are really paying the price, and this is what makes this such a terrible situation. Now, your point is that don't you think that if we had had the leaders who were in charge in the late 1940s and early 1950s, that they would have been more sagacious and that they would have avoided this disaster? I think a good case could be made that that's true. Again, you don't want to underestimate how many people have been opposed to this policy of bringing more and more countries, including Ukraine, into NATO from the get-go. There's been a lot of resistance. It's just that the other side has won at every turn.
Russia, throughout its history, has always believed in keeping some safety from the West, which has repeatedly invaded Russia. And after the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, the US and Germany had said to Gorbachev and to Yeltsin, we won't expand NATO 1 inch eastward. But then, like always with the United States, they lied, they cheated, and they started the expansion. And then the Russians, I was observing this all along, the first expansions, which were in Central Europe, didn't come too close to Russia. And they said, we don't like that. You cheated. You told us no. But okay, that's Hungary, Poland, and Czech Republic. That was 1999 under Clinton. But then it just kept coming and kept coming and kept coming. And they said with rising decibels and rising fervor, stop coming closer. And that's what President Putin has been saying for more than 2 decades. Keep a little space, be prudent. We don't want the United States right up against our border. And the US has really provoked it, not only overthrowing a Ukrainian president, bad judgment in my opinion, but also unilaterally walking out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002, unilaterally placing Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania. And when Russia says, what are you doing? You're breaking the whole security architecture. The US says, and I quote, it's none of your business what we do. NATO's none of your business, Russia. That's the formal, literal position of the United States of America, that we can go anywhere with any third country, including Ukraine or Georgia. We can put our missiles wherever we want. It's none of your business, Russia. Well, come on, Piers, this is going to get us all blown up. And I've seen nothing but US wars of choice and CIA ops my whole life. And since I became an international development specialist more than 40 years ago, I've seen many of them up close. And I'm tired of them. You know, a very good book written in 2017 by a professor at Boston College named Lindsay O'Rourke has the title Covert Regime Change. She studies, Piers, no fewer than 64 covert regime change operations by the United States, almost all of them CIA-led. 64 during the period 1947 to 1989. I've had heads of state say to me personally, Piers, they're gonna take me out, was the term that one of them used. And I assured them, this president it was Haitian president, no, we're gonna get all this sorted out, in my naive way. They walked this president, this was Aristide, out to an unmarked plane, flew him 23 hours in this coup that the US arranged to Central African Republic, and in a broad daylight launched a coup. And when I tried to get the New York Times to at least cover the story, I wanted to read about it, I was told by the reporter on the beat, oh, our editors aren't interested in that. So you can have coups in broad daylight. I've seen the United States launch wars all over the world that Americans and others don't even know were caused by the United States. It was only decades after the fact that Zbigniew Brzezinski told us that he had urged successfully Jimmy Carter to support the jihadists, the mujahideen, to try to overthrow the government in Afghanistan in 1979 to lure the Soviets into a trap. That would be their Vietnam. We messed up Afghanistan for more than 4 decades in that little typical U.S. regime change
But if you feel,
maneuver.
okay, but
into eastern Ukraine in February of 2022 it was unprovoked. Here's a selection of what we know about that.
The Russian military has begun a brutal assault on the people of Ukraine. Without provocation, without justification, without necessity, this is a premeditated attack.
Russia's unprovoked and cruel invasion has galvanized countries from around the world.
Russia's unprovoked and unjustified attack on Ukraine.
Russia conducted an unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine.
This unprovoked Russian war of aggression has got to be met with strength.
Vladimir Putin decided, unprovoked, to start this war.
So was it unprovoked?
Well, we did hear that a lot of times. I actually asked a research assistant of mine to count how many times we heard that in the New York Times in that first year from February 2022 to February 2023 in their opinion columns. It was 26 times unprovoked. Of course, things aren't unprovoked.
It's
that
almost
way.
a brand name, the unprovoked invasion.
It's the lazy person's dodge for actually trying to think through what's going on.
Yes.
And it's very dangerous because it's wrong. It gets the whole story completely wrong. And it misunderstands the trap that we set for ourselves as the United States to push Ukraine deeper and deeper and deeper into this hopeless mess that they're in right now.
So in what sense was it provoked? Like, what started this?
Basically, it started very simply, which is that the United States government, let's not call it the U.S. people, they had nothing to do with this, but the U.S. government said, we're going to put Ukraine on our side, and we're going to go right up to that 2,100 kilometer border with Russia, and we're going to put our troops and NATO and maybe missiles, whatever we want, because we are the sole superpower of the world, and we do what we want. And it goes back actually a long way. It goes back 170 years. The Brits had this idea first, surround Russia in the Black Sea region, and Russia's not a great power anymore. And that was Lord Palmerston's idea in the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. And the Brits taught us what we know about empire. And they basically taught us the idea, you know, Russia, it needs an outlet. It needs an outlet to the Middle East. It needs an outlet to the Mediterranean. You surround Russia in the Black Sea. You have rendered Russia a second or third rate country. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of our lead geostrategists of the current era, wrote in 1997, let's do this. Let's make sure that we basically surround Russia in the Black Sea region. They got this idea that we'll expand NATO so that every country in the Black Sea around Russia is a NATO country. Right now, well, back then, Turkey was a NATO country. But we said, okay, we'll get Romania and Bulgaria, and we'll get Ukraine, and we'll get Georgia. Now, Georgia, you know, not our Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, Georgia of the Black Sea.
We used to call it Soviet Georgia.
Yes, Soviet Georgia, if you want to call it that.
Home of Stalin.
It's not NATO North Atlantic. It's way out there on the eastern edge of the Black Sea region. People can look at a map. But we said, yeah, we'll make Georgia part of NATO too. And the reason was very clear, and Zbig was very explicit about it, that this is our way to basically dominate Eurasia. If we can dominate the Black Sea region, then Russia's nothing. If we make Russia nothing, then we can basically control Eurasia, meaning all the way from Europe to Central Asia, and through our influence in East Asia, do the same thing. And that's American unipolarity. We run the world. We are the hegemon. We are the sole superpower. We are unchallenged. So that's the idea.
But why would you want that? Why would the Brits want that? Why does the U.S. State Department want that? What about Russia, which is not actually much of an expansionist power, is so threatening? Like
it's not about Russia. It's about the U.S. It's about Britain before that. I think it's a little bit like that old game of Risk. I don't know if you played that as a kid, but the idea was have your piece on every place in the world. You know, that was the game. And you read the American strategists, whether it's Zbigniew Brzezinski, although he was very moderate, or the neocons who have run U.S. foreign policy for the last 30 years. The neocons are very explicit. The U.S. must be the unchallenged superpower. In every place in the world, in every region, we must dominate. It's quite a load for us American people. What they say is we are going to be the constabulary duty holder. What fancy word for saying we'll be the world's policeman. They say it explicitly. They say that's lots of wars. We have to be ready for all these wars. To my mind, it's a little crazy. But their idea was after the end of the Soviet Union, well, now we run the world. And to come back to Russia, the idea was, well, Russia's weak. It's down. We're the sole superpower. They're on their back or on their knees, whatever it is. And now we can move NATO where we want and we can surround them. And the Russians said, please don't do that. Don't bring your troops, your weapons, your missiles right up to our border. It's not a good idea. And the U.S., I was around in those years, involved in Russia and in Central Europe. The U.S. was, we don't hear you. We don't hear you. We do what we want. They kept pushing inside the U.S. government in the 1990s when this debate was going, should NATO expand? Some people said, yeah, but we told Gorbachev and we told Yeltsin we weren't going to expand at all. No, come on. The Soviet Union's done. We can do what we want. We're the sole superpower. Clinton bought into that. That was Madeleine Albright's line. NATO enlargement started. And our most sophisticated diplomats, we used to have diplomats at the time. We don't have them anymore, but we used to have diplomats like George Kennan, said this is the greatest mistake we could possibly make. We had a defense secretary, Bill Perry, who was Clinton's defense secretary, who agonized, God, I should resign over this. This is terrible. What's going on? But he was outmaneuvered diplomatically by Richard Holbrooke and by Madeleine Albright. And Clinton never thought through anything systematically, in my opinion. And so they decided, okay, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, first round. And then Brzezinski, in a 1997 article in Foreign Affairs magazine, which is kind of the bellwether of foreign policy, wrote a strategy for Eurasia where he laid out exactly the timeline for this U.S. expansion of power. And he said late 1990s, we'll take in Central Europe, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. By the early 2000s, we'll take in the Baltic states. Now that's getting close to Russia. By 2005 to 2010, we'll invite Ukraine to become part of NATO. So this wasn't some flippant thing. This was a long-term plan, and it was based on a long-term geostrategy. Now the Russians are saying, are you kidding? We wanted peace. We ended the Cold War too. You didn't just defeat us. We said no more. We disbanded the Warsaw Pact. We wanted peace. We wanted cooperation. You call it victory. We just wanted to cooperate. I know that for a fact because I was there in those years. What Gorbachev wanted, what Yeltsin wanted. They didn't want war with the United States, nor were they saying we're defeated. They were saying we just want to cooperate. We want to stop the Cold War. We want to become part of a world economy. We want to be a normal economy. We want to be normal society connected with you, connected with Europe, connected with Asia. And the U.S. said, we get it. We won. You do everything we say, and we determine how the pieces are going to go. So in the early 2000s, Putin comes in. First business for Putin was good cooperation with Europe.
Yes.
You go back to the early 2000s. Again, I know the people. I watched closely. I was a participant in some of it. Putin was completely pro-Europe.
Yes.
And pro-U.S., by the way.
I know.
And we don't want to talk about this. We don't want to admit it because we don't want anything other than unprovoked. So everything is phony, what we say. Everything is a lie. But just to say, the U.S. kept doing unilateral things that were really outrageous. In 1999, we bombed Belgrade for 78 days. Bad move. Absolutely. We bombed a capital of Europe for 78 days.
Looking back, what was the point of that?
The point of that was to break Serbia in two, create a new state, Kosovo, where we have the largest NATO military base in Southeast Europe. We put Bondesteel base there because we wanted a base in Southeastern Europe. And again, you look at the neocons, it's nice of them. They actually describe all of this in various documents. You have to make the links. But in a document called Rebuilding America's Defenses in the year 2000, they say the Balkans is a new strategic area for the U.S., so we have to move large troops to the Balkans because their idea is literally the game of Risk. Not just you need good relations or peace. We need our pieces on the board. We need military bases with the advanced positioning of our military everywhere in the world. So they wanted a big base in Southeastern Europe. They didn't like Serbia. Serbia was close to Russia. Anyway, we're the sole superpower. We do what we want. So they divided the country, which they now claim you never do. You never change borders. We broke apart Serbia, established by our declaration a new country, Kosovo. We put a huge NATO base there, and that was the goal. So that was 1999. So
it wasn't to save the oppressed Muslim population?
Excuse me?
It wasn't to save the oppressed Muslim population?
It was very, very much to save the military-industrial complex to have a nice location in Southeastern Europe.
We killed all those people, wrecked the city.
It was a little bit sad, but we do lots of sad things and lots of destructive things, lots of wars. We're the country of perpetual war. We don't look back. We're not even supposed to talk about this because this was unprovoked, remember? So in 2002, the U.S. unilaterally pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Unilaterally. Well, that was one of the stabilizers of the relationship with Russia, and it was one of the stabilizers of the global nuclear situation, which is absolutely dangerous. And the U.S. unilaterally started putting Aegis missiles into first Poland, then Romania. And the Russians are saying, wait a minute, what do we know you're putting in this? You're a few minutes from Moscow. This is completely destabilizing. Do you think you might want to talk to us? So then comes 2004, 7 more countries in NATO: Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Now, filling in the Black Sea, Romania and Bulgaria. Suddenly, they're now North Atlantic countries, but it's all part of this design, all spelled out, all quite explicit. We're surrounding Russia. In 2007, President Putin gave a very clear speech at the Munich Security Conference. Very powerful, very correct, very frustrated, where he said, gentlemen, you told us in 1990 NATO would never enlarge. That was the promise made to President Gorbachev, and it was the promise made to President Yeltsin. And you cheated. And you repeatedly cheated. And you don't even admit that you said this, but it's all plainly documented, by the way, and as you know, in 1,000 archival sites, so it's easy to verify all of this. James Baker III, our Secretary of State, said that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. And it wasn't a flippant statement. It was a statement repeated and repeated and repeated. Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister of Germany, same story. The Germans wanted reunification. Gorbachev said, we'll support that, but we don't want that to come at our expense. No, it won't come at your expense. NATO won't move 1 inch eastward, Mr. President. Repeated so many times in many documents, many statements by the NATO Secretary General, by the U.S. Secretary of State, by the German Chancellor. Now, of course, all denied by our foreign policy blob because we're not supposed to remember anything. Remember, this was all unprovoked. So back to 2007, Putin gives this speech and he says, stop. Don't even think about Ukraine. This is our 2,100 kilometer border. This is absolutely part of the integrated economy of this region. Don't even think about it. Now, I know from insiders, from all the diplomatic work that I do, that Europe was saying to the U.S., European leaders, don't think about Ukraine, please. This is not a good idea. Just stop. We know from our current CIA director, Bill Burns, that he wrote a very eloquent, impassioned, articulate, clear, secret, as usual, memo, which we only got to see because WikiLeaks showed to the American people what maybe we would like to know once in a while, but we're never told.
Like what our government's doing.
What they're doing and how they're putting us at nuclear risk and other things. Okay, this one did get out. And it's called Niet means Niet, no means no. And what Bill Burns very perceptively, articulately conveys to Condoleezza Rice and back to the White House in 2008 is Ukraine is really a red line. Don't do it. It's not just Putin. It's not just Putin's government. It's the entire political class of Russia. And just to help all of us as we think about it, it is exactly as if Mexico said, we think it would be great to have Chinese military bases on the Rio Grande. We can't see why the U.S. would have any problem with that. Of course, we would go completely insane. And
we should.
And we should, of course. The whole idea is so absurdly dangerous and reckless that you can't even imagine grown-ups doing this. So what happens is, for what I'm told by European leaders, and by long, detailed discussion, Bush Jr. says to them, no, it's okay. Don't worry. I hear you about Ukraine. And then he goes off for the Christmas holidays and comes back, whether it's Cheney, whether it's Bush, whatever it is, says, NATO's going to enlarge to Ukraine. And the Europeans are shocked, pissed. What are you doing,
So
George?
Bush did not make that decision.
Bush did not make the decision?
Right. I mean, if I'm hearing what you're saying.
I'm saying?
Yeah.
No, Bush did make the decision.
Okay. But
what I'm saying is he had told the Europeans, I hear you, I'm not going to do it.
But it sounds like he was influenced by the people around him.
That could be. Yeah, I don't know whether it was CIA or whether someone explained to him or whether someone said, George, Mr. President, this is a long-standing project. It's not something for a European country to object to. I don't know what happened there, but what I do know is that he came back and told the European leaders, no, we're doing it. They said, no, we're not doing it. And then they had the NATO summit in Bucharest, and this was 2008. And the Europeans, Chancellor Merkel, French president, all of them, George, don't do this. Don't do this. This is extraordinarily dangerous. This is really provocative. We don't really need or want NATO right up to the Russian border. Bush pushed. This is a U.S. alliance fundamentally, and they made the commitment. Ukraine will become a member of NATO. The dodge was, okay, we won't give them exactly the roadmap right now, but Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Because in those days, the U.S. and Russia met in a NATO partnership, even then, Putin was there the next day in Bucharest saying, don't do this. This is completely reckless. Essentially, this is our fundamental red line. Do not do this. The U.S. can't hear any of this. This is our biggest problem of all, because the neocons who have run the show for 30 years believe the U.S. can do whatever it wants. This is the most fundamental point to understand about U.S. foreign policy. They're wrong. They keep screwing up. They keep getting us into trillion-dollar-plus wars. They keep killing a lot of people. But their basic belief is the U.S. is the only superpower. It's the unipolar power, and we can do what we want. So they could not hear Putin. Even that moment, they couldn't hear the rest of the Europeans. And by the way, they said Georgia would become part of NATO. Again, the only way to understand that is in this long-standing Palmerston-Brzezinski theory. This isn't just haphazard. Oh, why don't we take Georgia? This is a plan. Okay, the Russians understand every single step of this. So another thing goes awry. What goes awry? The Ukrainians don't want NATO enlargement. The Ukrainians don't want it. They're against it. The public opinion said, no, this is very dangerous. Neutrality, it's safer. We're in between East and West. We don't want this. So they elect Viktor Yanukovych,
yes,
a president that says, we'll just be neutral. And that's absolutely the U.S.'s, oh, what the hell is this? Ukraine? They don't have any choice either. So Yanukovych becomes the enemy of the neocons, obviously. So they start working, of course, the way that the U.S. does. We got to get rid of this guy. Maybe we'll elect his opponent afterwards. Maybe we'll catch him in a crisis and so forth. And indeed, at the end of 2013, the U.S. absolutely stokes a crisis that becomes an insurrection and then becomes a coup. And I know, again, from firsthand experience, the U.S. was profoundly implicated in that. But you can see our senators standing up in the crowd like if Chinese officials came to January 6th and said, yes, yes, go. You know, how would we like it if Chinese leaders came and said, yeah, we're with you 100%. American senators standing up in Kiev saying to the demonstrators, we're with you 100%. Victoria Nuland famously passing around the cookies, but it was much, much more than the cookies, I can tell you. And so the U.S. conspired with a Ukrainian right to overthrow Yanukovych, and there was a violent overthrow in the third week of February of 2014. That's when this war started. This war didn't even start in 2022. It started in 2014. That was the outbreak of the war, was a violent coup that overthrew a Ukrainian president that wanted neutrality. When he was violently overthrown and his security people told him, you're going to get killed. And so he flew to Kharkiv and then flew onward to Russia that day. The U.S. immediately in a nanosecond recognized the new government. Oh, this is a coup. This is how the CIA does its regime change operations. So this is when the war starts. Putin's understanding, completely correct in this moment, was I'm not letting NATO take my naval fleet and my naval base in Crimea. Are you kidding? The Russian naval base in the Black Sea, which was the object of the Crimean War, and
yes,
in its way is the object of this war, in Sevastopol, has been there since 1783. And now Putin's saying, oh, NATO's going to walk in? Hell no. And so they organize this referendum of this is a Russian region and there's an overwhelming support. We'll stay with Russia, thank you, not with this new post-coup government. An outbreak breaks out in the eastern provinces, which are the ethnic Russian provinces in the Donbass and Lugansk and Donetsk. And there's a lot of violence. So the war starts in 2014. So saying something's unprovoked in 2022 is a little bizarre for anyone that actually reads a normal newspaper to begin with. But in any event, the war starts then. And within a year, the Russians are saying very wisely, we actually don't want this war. We don't want to own Ukraine. We don't want problems on our border. We would like peace based on respect for the ethnic Russians in the East and political autonomy, because you, the coup government, tried to close down all Russian language, culture, and rights of these people after having made a violent coup. So we don't accept that. So what came out of that was two agreements called the Minsk I and the Minsk II agreement. The Minsk II agreement was backed by the UN Security Council, and it said that we'll make peace based on autonomy of the Donbass region. Now, very interesting. The Russians were not saying that's ours, we want that, all the things that are claimed every day that Putin just wants to recreate. You know, he thinks he's Peter the Great. He wants to recreate the Russian Empire. He wants to grab territory. Nothing like that. The opposite. We don't want the territory. We actually just want autonomy based on an agreement reached with the Ukrainian government. So what was the U.S. attitude towards that? U.S. government attitude. U.S. government attitude was to say to the Ukrainians, don't worry about it. Come on, don't worry about it. You keep your central state. We don't want to see Ukraine weakened at all. We just want a NATO in a unified Ukraine. Don't go for decentralization. We tell them to blow off the very treaty that they've signed. Then we accuse Russia of not having diplomacy, by the way, which is, par for the course. Oh, you can't trust them. We blow off every single agreement. We blow off not moving 1 inch eastward. We blow off the anti-ballistic missile treaty. We have so many NATO-led wars of choice in between. I didn't even mention in Syria, CIA attempt to overthrow Assad, in Libya, and so forth. And we blow off the Minsk agreements. And actually, Angela Merkel explained in a rather shockingly frank interview that she gave last year, when asked why Germany didn't help to enforce the Minsk agreement, because Germany and France were the guarantors of the Minsk agreement under something called the Normandy process, she said, well, we just thought this was to give some time to the Ukrainians to build up their strength. In other words, they were guarantors of something in a phony way, and the U.S. was absolutely lying about this. And I know senior Ukrainians who were in government and who were around the government who said to me, Jeff, we're not going to do that. Anyway, that was at gunpoint. We don't have to agree with that. So all that diplomacy was blown off. The war continued. The U.S. pumped in arms, built up armaments, was building up what would be the biggest army of Europe, actually, a huge army that Russia was watching. What are you doing? You're not honoring Minsk. You're building up this huge Ukrainian army.
Paid for by NATO.
Paid for by the United States, basically, yes. And in 2021, Putin met with Biden. And then after the meeting, he put on the table a draft Russia-U.S. security agreement. Put it on the table on December 15th, 2021. It's worth reading. Very plausible document. I don't agree with some of it. It's a negotiable document, something you would negotiate. I thought the core of it was stop the NATO enlargement. And I called the White House myself at that point and said, don't have a war over this.
Who'd you talk to?
I talked to Jake Sullivan, and I said, don't have a war over this. We don't need NATO enlargement for U.S. security. In fact, it's counter to U.S. security. The U.S. should not be right up against the Russian border. That's how we trip ourselves into World War III. No, Jeff, don't worry. No war. There's not going to be a war. Don't worry. We've got a diplomatic approach. I said, Jake, this is a basis for diplomacy. Negotiate. Well, the formal response of the United States is that issues about NATO are non-negotiable. They're only between NATO countries and NATO candidates. No third party has any stake or interest or say in this. Russia, it's completely irrelevant. Again, to use the analogy, if Mexico and China want to put Chinese military bases on the Rio Grande, the United States has no right to interfere in
and
that
no interest in it.
And no interest in it and no bilateral. And this was the formal U.S. response in January 2022. So unprovoked, not exactly.
So can I
30 years of provocation where we could not take peace for an answer one moment. All we could take is we'll do whatever we want, wherever we want, and no one has any say in this at all.
So can I just go back 12, I guess 22 years? Putin told me, and I checked, I think it's true, that he, in Clinton's final days, asked Clinton if Russia could join NATO, which seems almost by definition like a victory.
Yeah.
NATO exists as a bulwark against Russia. If Russia wants to join the alliance, then you've won, right? Why would the U.S. government have turned that offer down? And do you think that is real?
Russia, and actually Europe, used to want before Europe was completely a kind of vassal province of the United States government, wanted what they call collective security, which was we want security arrangements in which one country's security doesn't ruin the security of another country. And there were two paths to that. There were basically three paths, let's say. One path was what they call the OSCE, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. Really a good idea. It's Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and former Soviet Union. And the idea was, let's bring us all together under one kind of charter and we'll work out a collective security arrangement. I liked it. I mean, this is what Gorbachev was saying. We don't want war with you. We don't want conflict with you. We want collective security. Second arrangement that actually makes a lot of sense, but people say, is this guy out of his mind? But it actually makes a lot of sense. Gorbachev disbanded the Warsaw Pact. We should have disbanded NATO. Said NATO was there to defend against a Soviet invasion. There's not going to be any Soviet invasion. In fact, after December 1991, there's not even a Soviet Union. We don't need NATO. Why is there NATO? NATO was established to defend against the Soviet Union.
Right.
So why did it continue after Gorbachev and Yeltsin? The neocons, thankfully, thank you, read the document, it's all explicit. This is our way of keeping our hegemony in Europe. In other words, this is our way of keeping our say in Europe, not protecting Europe, not even protecting us. This is hegemony. We need our pieces on the board. NATO's our pieces on the board.
Why would Germany allow foreign troops garrisoned on its soil for 80 years? I don't understand. Why would European country allow that? Would you want foreign troops in your town?
Tucker, when you had your wonderful interview with Putin, he answered everything except once you asked him, what are the Germans seeing in this? And Putin said, I don't get it. And I thought, oh my God, thank you. I don't get it either.
Is it just broken by war guilt? Is it masochism? I mean, honestly,
no, it's not masochism. It's not war guilt. There are basic mechanisms that I don't understand truly after being around more than 40 years in this and knowing all the leaders, and I know Schultz and I know others. I don't understand it, but when the U.S. has a military base in your country, it really pulls a lot of the political strings in your country. It really influences the political parties. It really pays. I know I'm naive. You know, in other words, the Germans are not, they're not free actors in this. That's the point.
If men with guns showed up in your apartment in New York and just camped out there, you probably wouldn't really be the head of your household anymore, would you?
It's probably true. But, you know, your question of why would the Germans want this? It's the same question of after the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, why wouldn't the Germans have said before or after, why did you do that? This is our economy you just blew up. But they don't. And so they're so subservient to the U.S. interests. It's a little hard to understand because it makes no sense for Europe. But like you said, you know, there are armed people in your house. Maybe that's the bottom line. I've spoken to European leaders who have said to me, I can't quote it because it's so shocking, and I won't quote it because it was said confidentially, but basically, they don't take us seriously in Washington. And I said, yes, I didn't say it was the bubble over my head speaking to a European leader, but maybe if you pushed a little bit, you would be taken more seriously, not in this way of just defeat. But it was said to me in such a sad way. I just felt, oh God, don't tell me that. You're a leader in Europe.